Aggregate Expenditure and Aggregate Demand by Thomas Ngyuen and Joe Piccolo. So what is aggregate expenditure? Aggregate expenditure is the current value of all the finished goods and services in the economy. Aggregate expenditure line is defined as the relationship tracing the spending at each level of income or real GDP for a given price level. So the components of aggregate expenditure. So GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So C is consumption, and that's 70%. I is investments, and that's 16%. G is government spending, and that composes 19%. And then X minus M is exports minus imports, and that's usually 5% of aggregate expenditure. So the aggregate expenditure graph, or the income expenditure model, is a relationship that shows how much people plan to spend at each income level. And this model identifies for a given price level, where the amount people plan to spend equals the amount produced in the economy. So this first point, there's unplanned inventory buildup, and to combat this, they will cut productions. And real GDP exceeds spending. And real GDP demanded is found where aggregate expenditure equals real GDP, right in the center. And then that third point symbolizes inventory reductions, and to combat this, they will produce more output. And also, spending exceeds real GDP at this point as well. So let's move on to the simple spending multiplier. It is the ratio of change in real GDP demanded to the initial change in spending that brought it about. It's called simple because only consumption varies with income. As long as spending exceeds output, production increases, thereby creating more income, which generates still more spending. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and this chart summarizes the multiplier process. There are the first 3 rounds, round 10, and then the cumulative effects on all the rounds. For example, in the chart, the new cumulative spending of an infinite number of rounds is $500 billion after a $100 billion initial increase of investment, given a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. So understanding the simple spending multiplier. Its numerical value is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And recall that MPS plus MPC always equals 1. So therefore, 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume equals the marginal propensity to save. And the simple spending multiplier in terms of the MPS is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. And the change in aggregate output demanded depends on how much the aggregate expenditure line shifts, not on which spending components causes the shift. So a quick little case study about aggregate expenditure, and there's a ripple effect on the economy caused by 9/11. So immediately after the attacks, all airlines were forced to ground non-military aircrafts, and airlines lost hundreds of millions of dollars a day in lost business. And there was also trauma such paranoia coupled with the airport delays and added security, and this reduced the demand for air travel once planes were allowed to fly again. And airlines were forced to request 15 billion aid packages of loans and grants from the government to avoid filing for bankruptcy. And airlines were forced to lay off 85,000 workers, about 20% of their workforce. And the U.S. economy at this point was already in a recession, and it reduced the demand for consumption and shook the consumers' confidence in the economy. And in total, the U.S. economy suffered over $100 billion in losses, or about 1% of the GDP. So moving on, what is aggregate demand? So it is the relationship between the economy's price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded, other things constant, of course. And the aggregate demand curve is a curve representing the relationship between the economy's price level and the real GDP demanded per period, also, once again, other things constant. And at each given price level, there's a specific aggregate expenditure line, which yields a unique real GDP demanded. So, a higher price level. It decreases the real value of money holding assets, and it cuts consumer wealth, making people less willing to spend at each income level. And it tends to increase the market interest rate, which reduces investment. Foreign goods become cheaper for U.S. consumers, and imports rise and exports fall, decreasing net exports. Result, it reduces consumption, planned investment, and net exports, and all reduces aggregate spending, which reduces real GDP demanded. In contrast, with a lower price level, the value of bank accounts, currency, and other money holdings increase, and consumers on average are richer and thus consume more each level of real GDP. And it tends to decrease the market interest rate, which increases investment. And U.S. products are cheaper abroad, and foreign products are more expensive, and exports increase and imports decrease. And another result is consumption, investment, and net exports increase at each level of real GDP. So the effects of a lower and higher price level. Aggregate expenditure line, AE, at point E, represents one possible curve at a combination of a price level of 110 and a real GDP demanded of 14 billion. At a higher price level of 120, aggregate expenditure line shifts down to aggregate expenditure, and real GDP demanded falls to 13.5 trillion. Price quantity combination is at point E. At a lower price level of 100, aggregate expenditure line shifts down to the AE, increasing real GDP demanded to 14.5 trillion. Price quantity combination is at point E. And connecting points E and E prime, and E prime yields the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD. So that's the end of our presentation. I hope you learned something, and I hope I get a 99 because that's what I need to get a B+. Thanks.